She texted the wrong number. A ruthless American Mafia boss replied, "I've been waiting 3 years to put a bullet in that badge. Don't move. I'm 5 minutes away." Florence Welsh gripped the marble edge of the kitchen island, her knuckles white against the stone. Every shallow breath sent a jagged spike of lightning through the bridge of her nose. The air in the penthouse tasted of expensive copper, the metallic tang of her own blood dripping onto her white silk robe like a macabre watercolor. She risked a glance at the corner of the room. There lay her custom Gibson guitar, a heap of splintered mahogany and snapped steel strings. It was a corpse, the final wreckage of a career her husband had systematically dismantled. It wasn't just wood and wire, it was the last piece of who she used to be, crushed under a black tactical boot. "Florence, sweetheart." Ernest's voice drifted through the heavy oak door, terrifyingly calm. It was his Officer Payne voice, the smooth, de-escalating tone he used on the evening news to soothe a panicked public. "You know I hate it when we fight. You just weren't listening, and look at the mess we've made. I can't let you go to that audition looking like that. I'm doing this for your own good. I'm protecting you." Protecting her. The same lie he'd been using to feed his own ego. He didn't want a star for a wife. He wanted a trophy tucked away in his shadow. The deadbolt rattled. He wasn't rushing. He was a hunter who knew the only exit was barred by his own NYPD badge and a 30-story drop. With blurring vision, Florence fumbled for her smartphone on the counter. Her fingers left crimson smears on the glass as she scrolled frantically for the one person who could save her. Justin, her brother. Through the salt of her tears and the haze of a concussion, names blurred into meaningless shapes. She tapped the contact that started with J and typed with one shaking hand, her heart thundering against her ribs like a frantic bird in a cage. He broke it again. "My nose. I think it's bad this time. He's going to kill me, Justin, please." She hit send and collapsed. Her back hit the cold wood of the cabinets, sliding down until she was a heap on the floor. The only sound in the kitchen was the rhythmic, sickening thud of Ernest's shoulder testing the door's resistance. Her phone buzzed. A reply, but not from Justin. A string of unknown digits burned at the top of the screen. "Who broke your nose? And where are you?" Florence felt the world tilt. A wrong number, a stranger. Her lungs seized as her husband's shadow eclipsed the thin line of light beneath the door. "I'm coming in now, Florence." Ernest's voice cut through her panic, dropping into that silky register that always preceded the worst of it. "Don't make me ask again. Reach up and turn that bolt. Open this door right now, or I'm counting to 3. The silence was heavy. Florence stared at the brass lock, her fingers twitching, but she didn't move. She couldn't. She was out of time and out of options. She had to choose between a stranger and a monster. She typed with shaking thumbs. "I need help. I'm hiding in the kitchen. 1422 Riverside Drive, Penthouse B. Please, he's breaking in." She dropped the phone as if it had burned her. A second passed, then 2. The phone buzzed a second time. This time the reply wasn't a question. It was a command that seemed to vibrate with a different kind of energy, precise and lethally certain. "Florence Welsh? Hold on, I'm 5 minutes away. Coming for you." Florence stared at the screen, her breath hitching. Florence Welsh? The name on the screen felt like a ghost's. How did a stranger on a wrong number know who she was? Before she could process the impossibility of it, the oak door groaned, a heavy, structural protest as the frame began to give way. 1. Ernest counted, his voice chillingly playful. The sound triggered a cold, visceral instinct. Florence didn't scream. She didn't run. She knew there was nowhere left to go. She curled herself into a tight ball against the cold base of the kitchen cabinets, pulling her knees to her chest as if she could disappear into the wood. Her white silk robe was a ruin of copper stains and shadows. She glanced at the phone. 5 minutes. In 5 minutes, Ernest would have moved past the counting. In 5 minutes, she would be a headline. She thought of the emergency line, then let the thought die. 911 was a joke in this city when the man coming through the door was the one who wore the badge. Ernest didn't just work for the police. He was the police. Any call she made would just be rerouted back to his brothers, a silent circle of protection that would end with her blood on the floor. And this stranger? A bitter sob caught in her throat. He was probably some obsessed fan who had tracked her number. Maybe a bored stranger playing a cruel game from 1,000 miles away. He wasn't a savior. He was a phantom. She was alone. She was already dead. The clock just hadn't realized it yet. 2? The syllable cut the air like a blade. A cold sentence before death. Outside, the silent night is shattered by a predatory growl, the synchronized roar of high-performance engines. It isn't the wail of sirens. It's a dark, mechanical thunder that shakes the glass in the windows. Florence closes her eyes, forehead resting on her bruised knees. She doesn't hope. She can't afford to. To her, that thunder is just more noise in a world that's already ended. A heartbeat passes, then another. The silence following the roar is even more terrifying than the noise. Then, a whisper from the other side of the wood, cold and final. 3. The door explodes inward. Ernest steps through the splinters, his service weapon drawn, his face a mask of righteous fury. "You think a locked door stops the law?" He sneers, stepping toward her, but he never reaches her. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind him shatter as a tactical team rappels from the roof, their black-clad forms silhouetted against the city lights like vengeful ghosts. Before Ernest can even pivot his weapon, the kitchen's main entrance is kicked clean off its hinges. A man steps through the dust. He wore a charcoal suit that fit like armor, his dark hair perfectly styled. He didn't look at the cop. He looked at Florence, specifically at the blood on her robe. "Drop it," the stranger commanded. Ernest, fueled by his badge and his rage, didn't drop it. He turned his gun toward the intruder. "I'm NYPD! Get the hell out of—" In a movement too fast for Florence to follow, the stranger was on him. He grabbed Ernest's wrist, the bone snapping with a sickening crack that mirrored what he'd done to Florence's nose. Ernest screamed, hitting the floor as the stranger's boot pinned his neck to the tile. The man knelt over the gasping cop. This wasn't just any man. This was Giuseppe Romano, the silent architect of the city's underworld and the head of the Romano Empire, a family whose influence ran deeper than the New York subway lines and reached higher than its penthouses. 3 years I have waited for a reason to put a bullet in that badge, Officer Payne, Giuseppe whispered, the gold on his watch glinting in the dim light. Tonight you gave me a reason. The bullet will come certainly, but not now, he assured him, his voice holding the weight of a death sentence from a king. With a cold, practiced efficiency, Giuseppe reached down and snatched the service weapon from Ernest's trembling hand. He didn't just take it, he dismantled it in front of the officer's wide, terrified eyes, dropping the magazine, racking the slide to eject the live round and tossing the components into the sink. He didn't look at Ernest again. In his eyes, the officer was already a ghost. Giuseppe turned toward the kitchen island. His eyes, which had been chips of black ice, softened as they landed on Florence. He moved into her space, smelling of expensive sandalwood and the sharp chill of the night air. He knelt, sliding one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back. "Close your eyes, Florence," he commanded, his voice a low, vibrating hum. Florence didn't fight him. She didn't have the strength left to wonder who he was or why he knew her name. All she knew was that the heavy, rhythmic thudding of Ernest's boots had stopped. The predatory air of the man holding her was terrifying, yes, but it was directed away from her. For the first time in years, she wasn't the target. She let her head fall against the charcoal wool of his suit, her blood-stained fingers clutching instinctively at his lapel. She felt herself being lifted with effortless power. He walked through the wreckage, past the splintered mahogany of her guitar, past the gasping man pinned to the floor, and carried her out of the apartment. The transition was a blur of motion, the cool air of the hallway, the silent descent of the elevator, and then the sudden, vast openness of the night. As they crossed the sidewalk, the synchronized roar of idling engines met them. He settled her into the back seat of a massive luxury sedan. As the door clicked shut, the world changed. The cold blue terror of the kitchen was replaced by a warm golden glow. The leather was soft, the air was silent, and the distance between her and Ernest Payne grew with every second. A heavy, profound relief washed over her, so thick it felt like sleep. She didn't care where they were going. She didn't care who the man beside her was. For the first time in 1,000 days, the door was locked from the inside, and the monster was on the other side of the glass. Beside her, Giuseppe remained silent, his sharp profile silhouetted against the city lights as the car pulled away with lethal, quiet speed. He watched her wrap her trembling fingers around a silk handkerchief, a strange, dark peace finally settling over her as the penthouse faded into the distance. The motion of the car was so smooth it felt like floating. Florence watched through the tinted glass as the Manhattan skyline retreated, replaced by the dark, winding roads of the Hudson Valley. Beside her, Giuseppe remained a silent shadow, his presence radiating a heat that felt both protective and predatory. The car slowed as it approached a set of massive wrought iron gates. They didn't just open, they retreated into the stone walls with a mechanical hum. As they wound up the long driveway, the Romano estate came into view, a sprawling fortress of glass and limestone that looked more like a museum than a home. "We're here," Giuseppe said, his voice cutting through the silence. The car stopped under a grand portico. Again, Giuseppe didn't wait for her to move. He stepped out and reached back into the vehicle, pulling her into his arms with that same effortless strength. Inside, the house was a cathedral of marble and warm, golden light. He carried her up a sweeping staircase and into a suite that smelled of fresh lilies and expensive linen. He settled her onto a plush velvet armchair near the window. "Stay," he commanded, though her legs felt too much like water for her to do anything else. Within minutes, a man in a white coat entered. Giuseppe's private doctor. He worked with a silent, clinical speed, cleaning the blood from her face and setting the fracture in her nose. Throughout the entire process, Giuseppe never left the room. He stood by the fireplace, his arms crossed, his dark eyes tracking every move the doctor made. He wasn't just a host, he was a guardian marking his territory. "The fracture is clean," the doctor whispered, packing his bag. "She needs rest, and no more stress." As the doctor exited, the room fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Florence looked at the silk handkerchief in her lap, now ruined by her blood. "You should sleep," Giuseppe said, walking toward her. He reached out, his tattooed hand hovering near her cheek before pulling back. "You're safe now, Florence. No one enters these gates without my permission, and no one leaves them without it either." The relief she felt was a double-edged sword. She was safe from the man who wanted to break her, but she was now in the hands of a man whose intentions are a silent, looming question mark. "My brother," she whispered, her voice finally returning. "I sent that text to him. If Ernest finds him." "I've already dispatched a team to his apartment," Giuseppe interrupted, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "Justin is being watched. Not by the police, but by me. You'll see him when it's safe. For now, your only job is to heal." He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "There's a music room down the hall. Everything you need is there, including the Gibson you thought you lost." The door clicked shut, and for the first time in years, Florence was alone in a room that didn't have a predator on the other side of the door. She slumped back into the chair, the golden light of the estate washing over her, realizing she had traded a cage of iron for a cage of gold. The morning light that filled the suite was too bright, too peaceful. Florence stirred, her hand instinctively flying to the bridge of her nose. The sharp, jagged pain of the night before had subsided into a dull, rhythmic throb. She found the music room at the end of the East Gallery. It was a professional studio, but in the center, resting on a velvet stand, was a replica of her 1959 Gibson Les Paul. It wasn't just the same model, it was set up exactly to her specifications. Florence reached out, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the fretboard. She didn't pluck a string. She couldn't. "The action is set a little lower than the factory standard," a voice spoke from the doorway. Florence turned to find Giuseppe. He stood in a black dress shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal the intricate tattoos winding down his forearms. He held 2 cups of coffee, offering one to her. "How do you know how I like my setup?" she asked, her voice cautious. Giuseppe leaned against the doorframe, his eyes tracing the curve of the guitar before settling on her. "I was in the 4th row at Lincoln Center 3 years ago," he said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant hum. "The way you played, it wasn't just music. It was like you were pulling something raw out of the air. I'd never heard anything like it." He stepped closer, his presence expanding to fill the room. "But it wasn't just the music, Florence. I watched you walk off that stage, and I saw a woman who had the world at her feet but was looking for a way to run. I became curious. I wanted to know what kind of fire could produce a sound like that." He offered her the coffee, his fingers grazing hers. A brief, electric contact. "I don't like seeing things of value discarded. When your label tried to sell off your publishing rights for pennies, I bought them. I couldn't let them silence a voice like yours." Florence blinked, her breath hitching as the pieces finally clicked. She had always wondered why her emergency royalties never seemed to dry up. "You've been protecting my work?" "I was keeping the path clear for when you finally decided to walk away from him," Giuseppe replied simply. He stepped into her personal space, the air between them thick with a heat that was heavy and absolute. "I didn't buy those rights to play hero, Florence. I bought them because a fire like yours isn't meant to be extinguished in a kitchen by a man who is afraid of its light. I wanted to ensure that the moment you realized the world was still waiting for you, you had the power to demand its surrender. I didn't want you to have to fight the industry or the public for what was already yours. I wanted you to step back onto that stage and find that your throne hadn't aged a day." He looked at her then, his gaze dark and unyielding. "I've spent 3 years preserving the asset, waiting for the woman to remember who she is. I didn't want a broken bird, Florence. I wanted the fire that used to make the city hold its breath. My interest wasn't in saving you. It was in witnessing you." The room fell into a vacuum of absolute silence. Within the soundproofed walls, the world outside ceased to exist. Only the heavy, synchronized beat of two hearts remained in the stillness. The hunger in his eyes made the truth undeniable. He hadn't just saved her legacy, he had been a silent guardian of her flame, and she was finally exactly where she was meant to be. The quiet of the music room was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic chirp of a radio on Giuseppe's belt. He silenced it instantly, but the air was already ruined. Florence's shoulders hiked toward her ears, a reflexive, jagged flinch that left her breathless. She stared down at her hands, still hovering uselessly over the Gibson strings. They weren't just shaking, they were frozen. She looked like a ghost haunting her own life. "The walls are 3 feet of reinforced stone, Florence," Giuseppe said, his voice a low, grounding anchor. He didn't move, yet his presence seemed to expand, demanding she look at him. "But they aren't the ones keeping you a prisoner." She looked up, her eyes glassy with the shame of her own reflex. "I'm still waiting for the sound of the door breaking," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Even here, even with you, I'm tired of being a shadow." Giuseppe's gaze didn't soften. It sharpened, challenging the victimhood in her eyes. "Then stop hiding in them. You want the flinching to stop? You have to learn where your center is, because right now, you've given it to him." He didn't wait for her to agree. He simply turned, his silhouette cutting a sharp line against the hallway light. "Follow me." Florence stood frozen for a heartbeat, the phantom weight of the 1959 Gibson still calling to her fingers. Then, she stepped out of the morning sun, and into his shadow. The walk was silent, the plush carpets of the living quarters giving way to the cold, echoing stone of the lower levels. As the air cooled, the scent of expensive cedar was replaced by the sterile, metallic tang of the private gym, a cathedral of cold light and silent iron. Giuseppe stepped onto the center of the mat, his movements possessing the fluid, predatory grace of a man who had survived 1,000 such rooms. He didn't wait for her to be ready. He moved into her space, his large hand coiling around her throat, while his other arm locked hers behind her back. The air in Florence's lungs turned to lead. The familiar sensation of being pinned, of being small, threatened to pull her back into the kitchen. Her heart hammered a frantic, messy rhythm. "You're fighting the air, Florence," Giuseppe murmured, his breath warm against her temple, his voice a low, steadying anchor. "Stop trying to pull away. That's what a victim does. A queen takes what is given." He tightened his grip, forcing her chest against his. "Feel my weight. Find the axis where my balance meets yours. If I push, you don't resist. You rotate, redirect the force. If someone tries to own your space, make it their tomb." Florence struggled, her heels skidding on the mat as she instinctively tried to outmuscle him. It was useless. He was a mountain of lethal intent. She felt a sob of frustration rise in her throat, but she swallowed it, replaced by a sudden jagged clarity. She stopped pulling. She went still, matching her breathing to his, feeling the exact point where his center of gravity leaned over hers. She visualized it like a sheet of music, a sharp, dissonant chord that required a perfect, singular resolution. "Now," Giuseppe whispered. With a sudden, explosive blur of motion, Florence didn't pull back. She stepped into him. She pivoted on the ball of her foot, shifting her hips deep under his center of gravity. Her hand shot up, seizing his forearm while her leg hooked sharply behind his heel, severing his connection to the floor. She twisted her entire torso with a sharp, controlled exhale, leaning into the gravity she had once feared. The air rushed out of Giuseppe as he hit the mat with a heavy, muffled thud. In a heartbeat, the world overturned. Using the momentum of his fall, Florence rolled with him, her knees pinning his bicep to the floor and her forearm pressing hard against his windpipe. She was breathing hard, her hair falling like a dark, tangled shroud around them. The silence in the gym was absolute, save for the ragged sound of her victory. Giuseppe didn't move to reclaim the position. He lay beneath her, his eyes dark with a raw, prideful admiration. He looked at the reddened skin of her hands, the hands of a virtuoso, and saw that they were no longer trembling. "The rhythm is perfect," he rasped, a dark smirk tugging at his lips. Florence didn't let go immediately. She stayed there, feeling the heat of the man she had just mastered, realizing that the noise of the kitchen had finally been drowned out by the sound of her own strength. She wasn't just a musician anymore, she was the conductor of her own survival. The weeks that followed were an exercise in reconstruction. Under Giuseppe's silent, watchful eye, Florence began to heal from the inside out. She spent her mornings on the mats, turning her fear into muscle memory, and her afternoons in the music room, turning her pain into a new, darker melody. She felt untouchable. Giuseppe had assured her that the Romano reach was absolute. "My men are with Justin," he had told her one evening on the terrace. "He's at the conservatory, he's at his apartment. Your brother is the safest man in New York." She believed him. For the first time in 3 years, the noise of Ernest Payne had faded into a distant, bad dream. The music room was filled with a fragile, beautiful peace. Florence sat with the Gibson in her lap, her fingers moving across the fretboard with a confidence she hadn't possessed weeks ago. The noise was fading. The music was returning. The peace was vaporized not by a sound but by a vibration. Her new phone, the sleek device Giuseppe had given her to replace the one Ernest had shattered, buzzed sharply against the mahogany piano bench. Florence set the guitar aside, her heart skipping a beat. She expected a message from Justin about his conservatory practice. Instead, the screen flickered to life with a video file from an unknown number. She pressed play. The footage was shot in the flickering, sickly green light of a basement. Florence's breath hitched, the air in the room suddenly feeling like ice. It was Justin. Her little brother was tied to a rusted metal folding chair, his lips split, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored her own from the kitchen floor. "Tell your new friend that the clock is ticking, Florence," Ernest's voice snarled from behind the camera. It was his Officer Payne voice, the one he used to command a precinct, but it was frayed, unhinged. "He thinks his watchers are elite? I grew up in these streets. I know every blind spot in this city. I want my wife back. 6 hours, Pier 42, alone. If I see a single Romano SUV, I'll send you his head in a guitar case." The screen went black. The phone slipped from Florence's trembling fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor. "Justin," she gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The strength she had found on the mats vanished, replaced by a jagged, white-hot panic. She spun around, seeing Giuseppe standing in the doorway. He had heard the video. "Giuseppe, he has him," she cried, her voice breaking. "He's going to kill him because of me. I have to go. I have to go now." Giuseppe was across the room in a second. He caught her wrists, his large, warm hands grounding her. "Look at me, Florence. Breathe. He said alone. If he sees a single one of your men." "He won't see me," Giuseppe said, his voice a low, predatory rumble that cut through her hysteria. He leaned in until their foreheads touched, forcing her to find his rhythm. "He thinks he's playing a game of force. He doesn't realize he's already stepped into a trap I laid weeks ago. You aren't a victim going to a slaughter, Florence. You are the hook, and I am the line." He wiped a stray tear from her cheek with his thumb, his gaze dark and absolute. "Nothing is going to happen to your brother." Giuseppe led her from the music room to the tactical nerve center. He tapped the glass of the main monitor, pulling up a 3D blueprint of Pier 42 and the surrounding industrial district. The screen hummed with live data feeds, thermal signatures, and intercepted radio frequencies. "Ernest is hiding in the one place he thinks he's safe, the blind spots of the city's surveillance," Giuseppe said, his fingers tracing the dark corridors of the digital map. "He spent years learning how to disappear from the precinct's grid, but I own the satellites he forgot to look for." He zoomed in on a blinking red dot near the water's edge. "He's waiting for a victim, Florence. He's expecting the woman who used to cower in the kitchen to come walking out of the dark, broken and alone. He's so focused on that version of you that he's blind to everything else moving in the shadows." Giuseppe turned to her, holding up a small, shimmering lapel pin, a masterwork of Romano tech. "You will go to the pier. You will give him the performance he's been dreaming of. While he's focused on the mask you're wearing, the world he thinks he controls will be pulled out from under him." Florence looked at the shimmering pin, then back at the map. "You aren't just going for him. You're going for everything he has. I am going to make sure that by the time you reach those warehouse doors, he is a man with no exit," Giuseppe whispered. "Tonight the city stops listening to his lies." The industrial alleyway was a canyon of rusted metal and damp brick. Florence stood in the center, her breath coming in shallow plumes. She looked small, exactly as Ernest needed her to look. Ernest stepped into the light. He looked haggard, his uniform rumpled. In his hand, he gripped a heavy plastic bag filled with white powder. "You really thought there was a place in this city where I couldn't find you?" he hissed. "I own you, Florence. You belong to me. You think Romano can protect you?" Ernest laughed. "If you so much as flinch toward him, I'll have my boys put a bullet in Justin's head. You're going to come home." He pressed the barrel of his service weapon against her ribs. "I don't need to kill you to keep you, Flo. I just need to break you. By the time I'm done with the paperwork, the world will think I found my junkie wife overdosing in a Romano rat hole. I'll be the grieving hero." He shoved her hard against the wall, the impact rattling the breath from her lungs. He pressed his full weight into her, his face a mask of distorted authority. You're under arrest, Florence. Possession with intent, he sneered, the badge on his chest a mockery of the violence in his eyes. I am the law, and the law says you're mine. Florence's spine was pressed against the unyielding stone, but the tremor was gone. She didn't pull away. She didn't fight the air. She found the axis. No, she whispered, her voice as cold as ice. You're just a headline. In one fluid motion, Florence drove herself into him. She seized Ernest's wrist, pivoted her hips deep under his center of gravity, and hooked his heel with a sharp, practiced snap. The momentum he used to pin her became the force that broke him. Ernest hit the wall with a bone-deep crunch, the air leaving him in a ragged gasp as he spiraled to the floor. His service weapon clattered against the wet concrete, sliding several feet away. Panic, raw and ugly, flooded Ernest's face. He scrambled on all fours, fingers clawing at the ground, his eyes wild as he reached for the steel. Just as his trembling hand closed around the grip, the mouth of the alley was swallowed by a blinding, predatory white glare. Giuseppe Romano stepped out of the light. He didn't rush. He moved with the heavy, inevitable momentum of a god of war. Behind him, 3 silhouettes emerged from the mist, his men silent and synchronized as shadows. In a final, desperate act of spite, Ernest wrenched the gun upward, aiming it straight at Florence's chest. The sound of the shot was surgical. Ernest screamed, his weapon spinning away as a bullet found his forearm with unerring precision. He collapsed back against the brick, clutching his shattered limb, the white bag of powder now soaked in his own failure. Giuseppe didn't lower his custom handgun. He kept it leveled at Ernest's heart. You're done reaching for things that don't belong to you, Payne, Giuseppe rasped, his voice vibrating with a lethal, quiet pride. Ernest collapsed back against the brick, clutching his shattered, bleeding arm. His breath came in ragged, pathetic hitches as he looked up into the barrel of Giuseppe's custom handgun. The silence in the alley was absolute, broken only by the hiss of steam and the rhythmic, terrifying drip of blood on wet stone. You can't, Ernest choked out, his voice cracking like dry glass. I'm a decorated officer. You kill me and this city will burn you to the ground. Giuseppe's finger tightened almost imperceptibly on the trigger. He leaned down, his face inches from Ernest's, lit by the predatory, cold glare of the SUV headlights. Death would be too easy a debt for you to pay, Ernest, Giuseppe whispered, the words carrying a weight more crushing than a death sentence. I'm not going to kill you yet. Not now. I'm going to take away the only thing you ever truly cherished, the lie of your own greatness. Ernest's eyes went wide. Giuseppe's voice dropped to a low, lethal rasp. You love the cameras. You pride yourself on the applause of the people you pretend to protect. So I've given you a final audience. I've made the very people you look down on your judge and your enemy. Giuseppe didn't look away from Ernest's crumbling face as his thumb pressed a button on the device in his left hand. Above them, the sky turned a brilliant, clinical blue. The massive digital billboards overlooking the district flickered, then roared to life. Ernest's own voice, arrogant, mocking, and cruel, erupted from the street speakers. The recordings of the bribes, the frame-ups, and the cold admission of his violence against Florence hit the internet and the airwaves simultaneously. Ernest's face went gray as he realized what Giuseppe had done. He wasn't just a man on the floor. He was a monster being unmasked in front of the millions he had tricked. Heavy, measured footsteps echoed from the mouth of the alley. Police Chief Michael Miller, the city's highest-ranking official and the face of the Metropolitan Police Department, stepped into the light, flanked by 4 stone-faced tactical officers. He didn't spare a glance at the blood. He walked straight to Giuseppe, the 2 men exchanging a firm, grim handshake, a silent pact between the law of the books and the law of the streets. The world is watching, Ernest, Chief Miller said, his voice cold and final as he looked down at the man who had disgraced the uniform. And they don't like what they see. Miller signaled his men. Take him. You're under arrest for kidnapping, evidence tampering, and the systematic abuse of the badge. You'll be lucky if the precinct gates can keep the public out. As the officers hauled the sobbing, broken man to his feet, the first wail of sirens began to howl, closing in like a pack of wolves. Giuseppe finally holstered his weapon and turned to Florence, his hand outstretched, a king reclaiming his queen from the wreckage of a lesser man's life. Florence took Giuseppe's hand, her fingers interlocking with his. As they walked away from the wreckage of Ernest's life, leaving him sobbing in the dark, the music he had tried to break was finally starting to play again. It wasn't a folk song. It was a symphony of reclaiming. As they stepped out of the mouth of the alley, the sirens still screaming behind them, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. One of Giuseppe's men, Marco, stepped out, his expression unreadable. He didn't say a word. He simply opened the rear door. Inside, sitting on the leather seat and wrapped in a thick wool blanket, was Justin. He looked pale, his eyes wide with a shock that hadn't yet faded, but he was breathing. He was whole. Florence broke into a run. "Justin!" She pulled him into a crushing embrace, her face buried in the scent of his laundry detergent, a mundane civilian smell that felt like a miracle in this world of gunpowder and wet stone. They walked into the house, Flo," Justin stammered, his voice trembling. "They didn't hurt me. They just told me I was going to see you." Florence looked up at Giuseppe, who stood several feet away, silhouetted by the city lights. He hadn't followed her. He stood back, giving her this one last piece of her old reality. In that moment, she realized the magnitude of his power. He hadn't just saved her. He had curated her safety by securing the only person who could be used as a leash against her. She whispered something into Justin's ear, a promise that he would be looked after, that he was safe now, and watched as Marco drove him away toward a safe house. Only when the taillights vanished did she turn back to Giuseppe. The bridge to her past had just been burned, and he was the only one holding the torch. 48 hours later, the penthouse of the Romano estate was silent. The only sound was the soft crackle of a fire in the hearth and the distant rhythmic hum of the city 10 stories below. Florence sat on the edge of the oversized leather sofa, her eyes fixed on the television screen. Beside her, Giuseppe poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass, his movements as precise and controlled as the man himself. The news anchor's voice was professional, devoid of the chaos that had transpired at the pier. Former Sergeant Ernest Payne, whose corruption scandal has rocked the city, was being transferred to a high-security facility earlier tonight, the anchor reported over footage of a rainy highway. He was killed when his transport van suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure on the FDR drive. There were no survivors. Florence watched the footage of the charred wreckage being hoisted from the river. She knew that in Giuseppe's world there were no mechanical failures, only final resolutions. She pressed the power button, and the screen faded to a silent, absolute black, leaving only their reflections in the glass. Giuseppe set his crystal glass down, the amber liquid barely disturbed, and moved toward her. The air in the penthouse seemed to thicken as he sat, the leather of the sofa creaking under his weight. He didn't offer an explanation for the charred wreckage on the FDR drive, and he didn't need to. The silence was heavy, saturated with the weight of every shadow he had moved and every life he had snuffed out to ensure she could finally sleep without one eye open. He reached out, his hand sliding behind her neck with a slow, deliberate heat. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, tilting her face up to meet a gaze that had shed its clinical mask. There was no longer a protector looking at an asset. There was only a dark, uncompromising admiration. "You're mine now, Florence," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that mirrored the pulse of the hearth. Completely, irrevocably, forever. Florence didn't flinch. She didn't look for an exit or a way to soften the blow of his possession. Instead, she reached up, her fingers curling with a sudden, sharp strength around his silk tie, pulling him down until their foreheads touched. She looked into his eyes, not at the wealth or the empire he commanded, but at the monster he was. The beautiful, lethal monster that had systematically dismantled her nightmare piece by piece. "I spent my life afraid of men like Ernest," she whispered, her voice steady and as cold as a sharpening blade. "I thought safety was the absence of violence. I thought it was found in the light." She leaned in closer, her breath ghosting over his lips. "But you showed me that safety is just having the bigger shadow." She didn't wait for him to claim her. She drove herself into him, initiating a kiss that wasn't a soft offering of gratitude, but a heavy, deliberate sealing of a blood pact. It tasted of expensive bourbon, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of the life they now shared. By pressing her lips to his, she wasn't just accepting his protection. She was absorbing his sins, pulling his darkness into her lungs until it became her own. She was stepping off the training mats of her old life and onto the floor of a throne room she had helped build with her own resilience. When she pulled back just an inch, the girl from the kitchen was gone. In her place stood something forged, hard, bright, and terrifyingly clear. "I know," she whispered against his mouth, her grip on his tie tightening as she claimed him back. "And you're mine. And God help anyone who tries to take what belongs to me." 6 months later, the doors of the Metropolitan Opera House swung open to a sold-out crowd. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and anticipation. In the front row sat Justin, looking healthy and bright, his eyes fixed on the stage with a pride that finally outweighed his fear. In the third row, centered perfectly, sat Giuseppe Romano. He didn't applaud when the lights dimmed. He simply watched, his presence a heavy, golden anchor in the room. Florence stepped into the spotlight. She wasn't wearing the white lace of a victim, or the soft colors of her past. She was draped in midnight silk that caught the light like oil on water, her hair shorn into a sharp, defiant bob. She held the black Gibson, the instrument of her rebirth, like a scepter. The first chord she struck wasn't a melody of forgiveness. It was a dark, vengeful crescendo that rattled the rafters of the hall and made the audience hold their collective breath. It was the sound of a woman who had found her voice in the heart of a storm and realized the storm was hers to command. As she played, she locked eyes with the man in the third row. She wasn't just a musician anymore. She was the Dark Muse of Empire. Outside, the city was vast and indifferent, but inside the music, a queen had finally claimed her throne, and she had done it at the side of her monster. If you made it this far, you know this isn't your average love story. This is what happens when the melody of salvation is written in the ink of danger. Hit that like button if Florence's transformation made your blood hum. Drop a comment and subscribe to Sovereign Obsession. Expect more thrilling romance tales from the Mafia boss, the billionaire CEO, and beyond.